Hello. Over the last few lectures, we've encountered some of the fabled names out of African history in the case of kingdom states like Egypt, Kush, and Ethiopia. Let's meet some more today, but shift our ground to West Africa, where over a period of 1,000 years, between about the 5th and 16th century, a series of major empires flowered in the West African savanna, also known, of course, that whole savanna belt as the Sudan. Among them were Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, which I will concentrate upon today. Now, such was the scale and the fame of these states, and such was the literal importance of gold, that the era is sometimes referred to as West Africa's Golden Age. Now, I keep using this term state, and I wonder if we shouldn't pause right now and get a little bit clearer idea maybe of what we're talking about and what it is that seems to propel the formation of states. We take it for granted. Everybody listening to this lecture has grown up in a state society, and in fact they have become virtually ubiquitous and universal in the world today. It was not necessarily always so, and I'll turn to the notion of stateless societies in a moment. But first, what is a state? There's a lot of ways you can define it, and I'm sure you've been in political science classes where they gave you very elaborate definitions and so forth. I'll offer a very quick set of 3 criteria which seem to define state, and in some respects this may be common sense. States have, of course, centralized, formalized authority. It's another way of saying someone is in charge. There is usually an office holder at the top. In the history of states around the world, it's usually been a monarch. Most states in world history have, in fact, been monarchies. Non-monarchical states is a relatively recent development. There are agents who carry out the business of the state. They may be bureaucrats like the scribes and tax collectors that we saw in the case of the Egyptian state. They may be armed agents of the state, and indeed the notion of a soldiery, of armies, particularly standing armies, seems to be one of the hallmarks of state formation. And a third criterion would be judicial institutions, that is, courts, bluntly. Now, this does not necessarily imply that courts are fair, but the way that society deals with the committing of crimes or the resolution of their disputes should operate through these courts, and we there sometimes see some overlap. That is not unusual to find a chief or a king who also functions as a sort of judge. Now, Africa produced many stateless societies in the long run of its history, and this is a little tough. It's a little bit like talking about matrilineal descent. It kind of throws us a little bit at first here. These seem to reflect a healthy suspicion of power. I encountered this very directly in my own research. When I went out to do my dissertation in southern Zambia, I was set in the midst of the Tonga-speaking portions, the Tonga ethnic group, Tonga tribe, if you like, of southern Zambia, who historically were indeed a stateless culture. I quickly found out that all the rage at that point in graduate school was to find, genealogies of kings and so forth. There were none. The Tonga did not have that structure of formal government, of authority figures, of chiefs, of kings, etc., etc. And when I say distrust of authority, I can illustrate that personally. A lot of my research was oral history, and basically was interviewing old men, some old women, but I would have to admit more old men. And I remember at one point I had taken a break from the research and gone 300 miles to the west to the Lozi Kingdom of the upper Zambezi River, which is quite a grand royal atmosphere. I went for the Kuomboka ceremony where the king leads the people out of the floodplain as the waters rise, and there are royal barges and musicians, and he goes to his rainy season palace on the margin and everything. And I returned to there and talked to some of these men that I'd gotten to know better, a little bit about it, and I was sort of hinting as if, well, gosh, aren't you a little bit sort of envious of all of this grandeur and pageantry and so forth associated with a kingdom like the Lozi? And I'll never forget their answer. They essentially said, yeah, kingdoms are great if you're the king. Royalty's great if you're part of the royalty. If you're not, if you're here or here or here as opposed to here, then maybe these kingdoms are not so great after all. They preferred to be stateless. Now, the word anarchy in its literal sense means without government. And technically speaking, literally speaking, the situation I just described was anarchy. It lacked government. But the connotation of anarchy to most of us is chaos. And that's where I think there is a disconnect there. I don't think it can be assumed that stateless societies were chaotic, although the maintenance of order was, shall we say, a more complex challenge than it would be where there are authority figures to impose it. If you recall the lecture number 6, where I talked about cross-cutting ties like exogamous marriage or age sets, which tend to bind together peoples otherwise divided vertically through time by descent, by unilineal descent groups usually. That seemed to be the key mechanism, which was the glue, in a sense, or the weave which kept the fabric of society. And in a sense, that notion of cross-cutting ties resembles the way that threads keep a fabric together. Well, that may be the case, and maybe the Tonga did like it that way. But the fact is that over the last 1,000 years, 2,000 years, almost century by century, decade by decade, we can see that state building and states become the order of the day in Africa as so much as elsewhere. And eventually they would, of course, be incorporated into different kinds of states, colonial states. And today wind up being parts of independence Africa's states. It might be a good time to sort of pause and identify what seem to be some of the factors underlying this trend, which we've glimpsed in our looks at Egypt, Kush, and Ethiopia, and today I think we'll see well illustrated in the West African savanna kingdoms. I'll just highlight a few of them. Total population and population density, we know, increased with Iron Age agriculture. It would appear that informal, lineage-based or age-set-based, cross-cutting tie-based means of resolving disputes and maintaining order were increasingly inadequate in this context of increasing population density. Now, a second factor is clearly critical, and that is concerns the whole world of security. The Tonga may have had a lot of things going for it. You can make an argument that the Tonga, in fact, enjoyed more in the way of equality, for instance, or freedom, if you like, didn't have to kowtow before an emperor and obey rules and so forth. They may have had a lot going for them, but military success was not one of those things, for the obvious reason that the kinds of authority structures, command structures, and so forth that make militaries effective were missing. Now, agricultural societies, as we mentioned before, with crops in the ground, cannot pick them up if they are threatened by outsiders. The need to organize for defense, in other words, may lead to authority structures. That may be the germ there, authority structures. And, of course, those same authority structures, once established, may, over time in a different generation, under a different leader or leaders, may turn from defensive to offensive. Now, there seems to be a quite clear correlation between the rise of states and the rise of long-distance trade. We've mentioned trade certainly in the case of Kush and so forth, and we're certainly going to see it today. States are good for trade by providing security, by, in a sense, negotiating trade agreements, if you like, a popular pastime for political leadership these days. The opposite, though, is also true, that trade is good for states in the sense that states tax it repeatedly. And we'll see examples of that today as well. To support the state structures, and finance them like the bureaucracy and the armed forces. Nonetheless, history is not chemistry, and you can't take 2 parts population density and 1 part long-distance trade and equal a kingdom. Kingdoms are made by kings, occasionally by queens, or ruled by kings, occasionally by queens. And we can't take that personal factor out of it. We're going to see some legendary personalities today, in fact, in our survey of West African states. Now, the best known of the early Iron Age states of the West African Sudan, again, the Sudan is the entire Savannah belt. The best known of these was Ghana. The name Ghana was adopted by the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from colonial rule in 1957, and that was the former British colony of the Gold Coast. But in fact, there's no direct connection or even overlap geographically between the Gold Coast, which took the name of Ghana, and ancient Ghana, which lay several hundred miles northwest of the modern nation. Nonetheless, this was a symbolic move to reach back into African history in a sense and appropriate some of its assumed glory. Now, ancient Ghana, straddling, in fact, the Sahel, which is the semi-desert strip between the savannah and the desert, the Sahara, was well situated to take advantage of trading networks across the Sahara itself. And that, of course, means that Ghana, like the ones that we will talk about in a moment, Mali and Songhai, were connected across this desert to the Mediterranean world and by extension to the European and Near Eastern worlds. The trans-Saharan trade was revolutionized by the 3rd to the 5th century by the introduction, originally by North African Berber nomads, of the so-called ship of the desert, the camel, which certainly provided far superior possibilities for traverse of this ocean of sand. Ghana's traders and rulers prospered then by assuming a middleman position between the resources, particularly important resources of salt to the north, and gold from the Bore gold fields to the southwest. And in a sense, that was one leg of a kind of domino effect, leading eventually to the Mediterranean and Europe. Middleman position, where that came up yesterday when we were talking about the kingdom of Kush, and when I quoted Rhoda Oliver saying that this was the prototype of later Savannah kingdoms. That's what he had in mind, was this middleman trading position. Now, Ghana's core ethnic group was the Soninke people. The Soninke kings, who claimed automatic rights over gold nuggets as opposed to gold dust in the kingdom, which is a form of taxation, of course, were able to extend their power over numerous other ethnic groups. This was, like all of these kingdoms today, all of these empires, I suppose, a multi-ethnic phenomenon. And by the way, the Soninke kings of old Ghana are a nice illustration of the notion of matrilineal descent, but combined with patriarchal rules of power. Kingship was, in theory, and usually did, go from a male to a male. But it followed matrilineal rules of transmission or of succession. There's a quote from al-Bakri, the North African base, originally based in Spain, Islamic Spain, at that time, who visited Ghana in about 1067. He said that this is their custom and habit, that the kingship is inherited by the by the son of the king's sister. So the king himself in a matrilineal society cannot pass on membership in the royal lineage to his own children. Who can do that, of course, is his sister. And his sister can pass this on to what we would call his nephew, and that would be the successor to the king. Now, after the 7th century, of course, Ghana's trading partners to the north were increasingly likely to be Muslims. Trade was the most obvious vehicle for bringing the faith into the Sudan. As I said in a previous lecture, the catchphrase emerged in the 19th century of Christianity and commerce, but over the long run, I think there's actually been a more direct link, a more consistent link between Islam and commerce, and it certainly is the case here. However, for quite a long time, Islam appears to have been tolerated rather than embraced. A description, again, of Ghana's capital from this traveler and writer al-Bakri starts essentially by describing the capital of Kumbe Saleh as essentially twin cities, and divided by about 10 miles. One portion of it was the seat of royal power. The other was specifically a town where Muslim traders from the north were housed. And I'd like to read you an excerpt from al-Bakri's description of the non-Islamic portion of this, and that includes Ghana's kings at the time that he visited. The king's residence comprises a palace and conical huts, the whole surrounded by a fence like a wall. Around the royal town are huts and groves of thorn trees where live the magicians who control the religious rites. These groves, where they keep their idols and bury their kings, are protected by guards who permit no one to enter and find out what goes on in them. None of those who belong to the imperial religion may wear tailored garments except the king himself and the heir presumptive, his sister's son. The rest of the people wear wrappers of cotton, silk, or brocade according to their means. Most of the men shave their heads and the women their heads. The king adorns himself with female ornaments around the neck and arms. On his head he wears gold-embroidered caps covered with turbans of finest cotton. He gives audience to the people for the redressing of grievances in a hut around which are placed 10 horses covered in golden cloth. Behind him stand 10 slaves, carrying shields and swords mounted with gold. On his right are the sons of the vassal kings, their heads plated with gold and wearing costly garments. On the ground around him are seated his ministers, while the governor of the city sits before him. On guard at the door are dogs of fine pedigree, wearing collars adorned with gold and silver. Well, that referred to a king quite resistant, but tolerant obviously for commercial reasons of self-interest of Islam. Eventually, however, in the later 11th century, Ghana's rulers did convert, and while this might be assumed to provide a fillip to wider conversion, how wide or deep this went among the general population is really an open question. Now, in the early 1200s AD, rivals to the Soninke kings of Ghana emerged. A young Malinke chief, and this is another classic and important ethnic group in West Africa, Malinke. Malinke chief eventually proved triumphant. His name was Sundiata, and he was founder of the most legendary West African empire of all, and that was the Empire of Mali. Now again, Mali, of course, is the name of a contemporary African country, and that's also not accidental. Now, the story of Sundiata is the basis of the most famous epic from Africa, probably all of Africa, certainly West Africa. It's been transmitted in its considerable length orally for several centuries, and this was the job of the so-called griot, G-R-I-O-T. The griot was a combination of oral historian and usually musician and entertainer, a bit reminiscent perhaps of bards and troubadours in medieval Europe. His instrument with which he accompanied the recitation of an epic like Sundiata was often the koro, the beautiful sounding string instrument which is so important in Savannah African music. Some people who have gotten deeply into oral history, somebody popularized the phrase, when a griot dies, it's as if a library has burned down, and in some respects that's probably true. Now eventually the Sundiata epic was recorded, translated, and it's been published in quite a number of versions. There are versions that essentially attempt to replicate the verse form of it, others which have taken a more dramatic kind and so forth. I'll be personal here. When I long ago began to start teaching this subject, I said to myself, well, this is the most famous epic out of Africa. I better read it, I think, And I have to confess to you that I was a little bit daunted by that. I mean, it's quite lengthy in most of its written versions, and I thought, well, it may be a bit tough going. It may be a bit obscure to try to get into this. Now, I have to tell you that the version that I first chose, which was a very novelized version written by the 20th century West African writer Camaralai, based on his listening to Babu Kandea, a master griot, both of them now deceased. I must say, once I got into it, I couldn't put it down. It has everything. It's got love and desire and friendship and treachery and betrayal and action, a lot of action, as you might expect in this kingly epic. It has elements of the mystical in it, and it certainly echoes things like the Arthurian legends and maybe the Odyssey as well. I'd like to give you just some taste of this by reading just one passage. Now, again, this legendary figure, again, is enshrouded with almost supernatural powers and so forth, so that Sundiata is said to be born disabled. He's unable to walk, unable to stand, and eventually goes into exile and then returns in force and takes over, confronts the bad guy, the evil figure in the story, and establishes Mali. But of course, before doing that, he walks, and that's the passage I was going to read to you from Camaralai's translation of Sundiata. His confidence in himself had visibly increased. It could be seen in his face. Sundiata lowered his head. When he lifted his head again, he saw nothing but the iron bar before him. Sorry, he's in essence on his knees before this bar above him. The next moment, he boldly hauled himself up, his head completely thrown back. Suddenly, in a supreme effort, his biceps bulging, he managed to stretch himself completely upright. And then releasing the bar, he found himself still upright, planted on his own two legs. The iron bar had become twisted and taken on the form of a bow. Was it Giada's strength that had bent the bar? Perhaps. It's a little bit redolent of, the sword and the stone and phenomenal feat of strength that you get in some of the old Arthurian legends. Now, Sundiata himself seems to illustrate the symbiotic or syncretic, coexistent or blended nature of religious life and religious conversion that we talked about a couple of lectures ago. He's described as a devout Muslim in some contexts, but in others he's still quite clearly, including in the version of the epic that I mentioned, still quite concerned to be on the good side of the priests and oracles connected with the older land-based earth spirits and so forth. By its peak in the 14th century, the Mansas, and Mansa is the Malinke term for king, of Old Mali, ruled an empire stretching thousands of miles from the Atlantic Ocean eastward across the great savanna belt. For a quick glimpse of the empire at its peak, again, let us go to one of these North African-based writers. This is Ibn Battuta, who covers a lot of ground. We'll even meet him in the next lecture on the other coast, on the East African coast. He visited Niani, the capital of Old Mali, in 1352, and he was impressed. At first, he was really downcast because their diet was basically millet, again the great grain of the savannah, and milk, cattle, obviously important there, but it was not quite the varied fare he was used to in North Africa. But he warmed to the place, and he said this, quote, "The Negroes possess some admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Their sultan," which in this case is the Mansa, the king, "shows no mercy to anyone guilty of the least act of it," injustice that is. "There's complete security in their country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant in it has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence? Well, the most famous of old Mali's rulers, the Mansas, was Mansa Kankan Musa. In 1324 and 1325, he undertook the journey that, in theory, all devout Muslims should take once in their lifetime, the Hajj, the travel to Mecca itself. As a king, he went in kingly style. It was said in some sources 80 camels, other 100 camel loads of gold apparently went with him. Something like 500 slaves were supposedly in the forefront of this caravan. I've mentioned slaves on a couple of occasions, and I'll take up the notion of indigenous slavery as opposed to transcontinental in our lectures number 13 and 14. His journey to Mecca in 1324 and 5 drew a lot of attention, and in some respects definitely put Mali on the map of the medieval world. The very fact that he undertook it shows that Islam has certainly become more entrenched, and there's no question that Musa is remembered as a particularly devout adherent of Islam. He encouraged Muslim scholarship and literacy using that is literacy in the local languages, including Malinke, utilizing the Arabic script. He distributed so much gold when he was coming through what's now Cairo in Egypt on his way home, so much as gifts and so on, that the contemporary accounts suggest that his journey was responsible for gold's devaluation at the time. Now, as Mali's power waned in the 14th and 15th centuries, pride of place in the Sudan and the old savannah passed to the empire of Songhai. Its center of gravity was further east, along the middle reaches of the Niger River. The founder king here was Soni Ali, who, despite his name, was generally considered an apostate in the Muslim sources, a backslider, if you like. He was a formidable general, however, and utilized horses and war boats. I mention horses there, and indeed, horses and the association of horses with aristocracy and with nobility, with kingship, is something that's obviously quite common in medieval Europe, for instance. And the same is true here. When Sudanic kings, obviously in a sense no longer sovereign, today hold, processions and so forth. You'll see many decorated horses as part of that. Now, Soni Ali's heir was overthrown by the more devout Mohammed Touré, the founder of the Iskaya dynasty. He was credited with centralizing administration, reviving the trade in gold and salt, as well as in cotton and cola and horses, and like Mansa Musa before him, making the pilgrimage, the Hajj. Songhai's power was finally broken in 1591 by a Moroccan army invading from the north across the desert and using a new weapon, muzzle-loading firearms. Now, this may be a harbinger. It may be an omen of a turning point which we are approaching. Guns have arrived. I'm going to end by noting a prominent city in both Mali and Songhai, and that was Timbuktu. It's actually a quite real place, located at the edge of the desert in the far bend of the Niger River. It was originally a settlement of Tuareg nomads, but it became a thriving market center and entrepot of trans-Saharan trade, and even more so, a focal point of intellectual life. Again, I'm going to give you one last first-hand account, and this one comes from Leo Africanus. Again, that's the pen name he wrote under, in the early 1500s when he visited Timbuktu. There are many shops of craftsmen and merchants, especially those who weave linen and cotton cloth. To this place, merchants bring cloth from Europe. All the women of this region, except maidservants, go with their faces covered and sell all necessary kinds of food. The inhabitants are exceedingly rich, so much so that the present king has married both of his daughters to two rich merchants. The rich king of Timbuktu, the governor, if you like, of that area, has many articles of gold, and he keeps a magnificent and well-furnished court. When he travels anywhere, he rides upon a camel which is led by some of his noblemen. He travels likewise when he goes to war, and all his soldiers ride upon horses. Attending him, he always has 3,000 horsemen and a great number of footmen armed with poisoned arrows. Here there are many doctors, judges, priests, and other learned men that are well maintained at the king's costs. Various manuscripts and written books are bought here and are sold for more money than any other merchandise. Well, thanks to Leo Africanus, we've been able to go from now to then, and from here to Timbuktu. Thank you.